The man's words were sharp, cutting through the air as he leaned forward in his seat. "You don't belong here," he sneered, his voice dripping with contempt. The woman, sitting calmly in her seat, didn't flinch. She simply looked ahead, her hands resting in her lap, her eyes hidden behind large sunglasses. Her silence was more powerful than any words could have been. The passengers around them shifted uncomfortably, some glancing at each other, unsure of how to react. The flight attendant, standing at the front of the cabin, seemed oblivious to the tension building in the small corner of the plane. But then something changed. The man's confidence wavered for just a moment. The woman, who had remained so composed, finally turned her head, her gaze locking onto his with an intensity that made him hesitate. He didn't know why, but the sight of her eyes made his heart skip a beat. "Do you know who I am?" she asked quietly, her voice soft but filled with a quiet strength that made the man's chest tighten. He scoffed, ready to dismiss her words, but there was something in her tone that stopped him. Something unfamiliar. The woman didn't wait for him to respond. She stood up slowly, gracefully, like someone who had learned to carry a weight far heavier than anyone could see. Without a word, she moved toward the aisle, her back straight, her steps sure and unwavering. The man leaned back in his seat, momentarily stunned. But as she passed by him, something caught his eye, something that made his blood run cold. A single photograph, tucked into her bag, visible for just a moment. It wasn't just any photo. It was his. The man's mind raced as realization hit him like a bolt of lightning. The woman was no ordinary passenger. She wasn't just anyone. And the last thing he ever expected was that this encounter, this moment of arrogance and cruelty, would change everything. What was the connection? How did she know him? As the plane continued to hum through the clouds, the man's world flipped upside down. The woman, the quiet stranger who he had so carelessly insulted, wasn't just someone to ignore. She was someone he should have feared. And now, there was no turning back. The airplane cabin was filled with the low hum of the engines, the soft murmur of voices, and the occasional clinking of metal against trays. But for the man sitting in seat 22C, there was a storm brewing inside him. His brow furrowed as he stared out of the small window, his hands clenched tightly around the armrests. The flight had been uneventful, but his patience was thinning, and something about the woman sitting 2 rows ahead of him was gnawing at him. She hadn't done anything wrong. In fact, she'd barely even moved since the flight began. But it was her presence that unsettled him. The calmness in her demeanor, the way she seemed so unaware of the tension surrounding her. She was a black woman, sitting alone in her seat, her arms folded neatly across her chest. Her face was hidden behind large dark sunglasses, and her expression remained unreadable, almost as if she was lost in her own world. The man sneered at the thought. Lost in her own world. He couldn't stand people like her, people who acted as if they were untouchable, above others. There was something about her that made him feel small, and he hated it. She wasn't even doing anything. She was just sitting there, looking so perfect. He shifted in his seat, feeling a wave of anger rise within him. His thoughts grew darker, fueled by years of resentment and frustration. He had worked hard to get to where he was. He had earned everything he had, his success, his lifestyle, the way people respected him. And yet, here was this woman, this stranger, sitting like she belonged in his world. He couldn't tolerate it. Without thinking, he stood up abruptly, his movements sharp and jerky. He ignored the brief flicker of discomfort that passed over the passengers around him, focusing only on the woman in front of him. He walked down the aisle, his eyes narrowing as he approached her seat. "Excuse me," he said, his voice dripping with disdain. "Do you really think you belong here?" The woman didn't respond immediately. She didn't even look at him. She simply adjusted her sunglasses, the only sign that she had heard his words. The man's mouth twitched in frustration. I'm talking to you, he repeated, his tone more insistent now. Do you honestly believe that you should be sitting here, like you're some kind of VIP? At this, she slowly turned her head toward him, her gaze never leaving his face. He couldn't see her eyes, hidden behind the dark lenses, but there was something in her posture, something in the stillness of her body that made his heart race. It was like she was studying him, assessing him in a way that made him uncomfortable. "Excuse me," he asked again, his voice rising slightly, as if to provoke a reaction. "Are you going to answer me or just sit there pretending like you don't hear me?" The woman's lips parted, and for a brief moment, the man thought she was about to speak. But instead, she did something entirely unexpected. She stood up, her movements slow and deliberate. She was tall, but there was something about the way she carried herself that made her seem even taller. Every step she took was calm, measured, but there was a quiet strength in her that made the man hesitate. She moved past him, brushing her shoulder lightly against his as she walked down the aisle. He expected her to be rattled, maybe even apologize, but there was no sign of fear, no hint of shame. She was simply walking with the same quiet grace that she had maintained since the flight began. The man watched her, his breath shallow. What was going on? He had expected her to cower, to be intimidated. But instead, she was composed. And that infuriated him even more. "Where do you think you're going?" he called out, his voice louder now, more demanding. "You can't just walk away from me like that." The woman didn't turn back to look at him. She continued walking, her heels clicking softly on the floor as she made her way to the front of the cabin. The man felt his temper rise, but he refused to give in. She would have to answer for this. He followed her down the aisle, pushing past the rows of seats, determined to get some kind of response from her. The other passengers watched, some with curiosity, others with discomfort. The woman didn't seem to care about their gazes. She was focused on the front of the plane, her steps never faltering. And then, just as he was about to reach her, she stopped. The man stumbled slightly, his momentum throwing him off balance. He came to a stop just behind her, his breath coming fast, his heart pounding in his chest. "Do you know who I am?" she asked quietly, her voice so soft it almost seemed like a whisper. But there was an authority behind it, a quiet power that made the man pause. His mind raced. "What? Are you trying to intimidate me? You think I care who you are?" The woman turned slightly, her face still hidden behind the sunglasses. "Do you really not know?" she asked, her voice still calm but with an edge that sent a shiver down his spine. The man's jaw tightened. What was she playing at? He wasn't afraid of her. He wasn't going to back down. But something inside him told him this wasn't a moment he could just brush off. There was something in her words, in the way she spoke, that made him uneasy. "I don't care who you are," he spat, trying to push past the unease that had started to creep into his chest. "You have no right to talk to me like that." The woman didn't respond immediately. She simply stood there, her back straight, her hands folded neatly in front of her. And then, without warning, she did something that left the man speechless. She reached into her bag and pulled out a small photograph. At first, he didn't recognize it. It was a simple photo, slightly faded, but it held a certain weight, an importance that the man couldn't explain. He glanced down at it, and his heart stopped. It was a photo of him. The man blinked, his mind struggling to make sense of what he was seeing. It was a photo from years ago, one he hadn't thought about in a long time. He was standing in front of a large mansion, a young woman beside him, smiling, her arm around his waist. The same mansion that had belonged to his family. The same woman he had once been so close to, his sister. He recoiled, taking a step back. His head spun, his vision blurred as the reality of the moment sank in. How could this woman have this photo? How could she know anything about him, let alone something so personal? She was still holding the photo, her fingers gently tracing the edges. And then, she spoke again, her voice low and almost contemplative. "You really don't know who I am, do you?" she said. The man's mind was racing, his heart pounding in his chest. He tried to speak, to say something, but the words caught in his throat. How could this woman possibly know him, let alone have something so personal? As the truth began to dawn on him, his stomach twisted in knots. This woman, this stranger he had insulted so carelessly, was not just anyone. She was someone from his past, someone he had never expected to cross paths with again. But now, it was too late. The damage had been done. And the flight was just beginning. The plane was silent. The hum of the engines was almost a distant memory as the man stood frozen in the aisle, his eyes locked on the woman who had just revealed something that shattered everything he thought he knew about himself. She was still holding the photograph, her fingers gently tracing its edges, as though she had all the time in the world. She didn't hurry. She didn't flinch. The man, whose breath had caught in his chest, could barely comprehend what was happening. His body felt cold, his palms sweaty. He could hardly bring himself to speak, let alone take another step closer to her. "Who are you?" he finally managed to croak, his voice barely above a whisper, full of disbelief. The woman tilted her head slightly, her expression still unreadable behind the dark lenses of her sunglasses. For a moment, it seemed as though she was about to speak, but then she merely took a step backward, closer to the wall of the airplane, and motioned for him to sit. "I think you need to sit down, before this gets out of hand," she said softly. His instincts told him to refuse, to demand an answer, to not let her control the situation any longer. But something about her calm demeanor stopped him. A strange sense of dread washed over him. This wasn't just some random woman. This wasn't a coincidence. She was involved in something much bigger, something that now, in that instant, was beyond his control. Reluctantly, the man dropped into his seat. His mind was spinning. His pulse throbbed in his ears. He had known that he had enemies, but this? This was something entirely different. The woman didn't sit. Instead, she turned her attention back to the photo, her lips curling slightly as though she was considering what to say next. "Let me guess," she said, her voice smooth, as if she was playing a game. "You thought you were untouchable, didn't you? That no one could see through the armor you've built for yourself. You really thought you were above everything and everyone." He didn't respond. His mind was racing, but he couldn't bring himself to argue. She was right. He had built a life, a persona, of power and privilege. He'd convinced himself that no one could touch him, no one could see the real him. But she did. She knew who he was. She knew more than he ever thought possible. "Who? Who are you?" he repeated, his voice now shaky, as he glanced around the cabin. Some of the passengers were watching him closely, but no one dared intervene. It was as though they could sense that this moment was bigger than anything that could happen in the next few hours. The woman finally sat down in the seat opposite him, still holding the photograph. She set it down carefully on the tray in front of her. Then, with the calmest of expressions, she spoke again. "My name is Evelyn Carter," she said. "And I'm your sister." His heart stopped. The words echoed through his mind, each one slicing through the chaos swirling inside his head. Sister? This couldn't be real. He didn't have a sister. He didn't remember having one. The name didn't even ring a bell. "Impossible," he whispered, shaking his head. "You're lying. I don't have a sister." Evelyn didn't seem to be fazed by his disbelief. "I wasn't raised as your sister," she said, her voice calm, almost detached. "But I am, and I've been waiting for this moment for a long time." He blinked, unable to process what she was saying. He knew that she must be mistaken, there was no way. He tried to think back, to remember his childhood, to grasp onto any shred of recollection that could explain her claim. But his memories were scattered, disjointed, nothing was clear. "You've been waiting?" he asked, his voice thick with suspicion. "What is this? What do you want from me?" She leaned forward slightly, her eyes never leaving his. "I don't want anything from you. I just wanted you to know who I am. To know the truth." "The truth?" He laughed bitterly, but the sound was hollow. "And what truth would that be?" Evelyn paused, her fingers tapping lightly against the edge of the tray. "That you've been living a lie your entire life." For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The words hung in the air, thick with tension. The man was fighting to maintain some semblance of control, but he felt as though he were being dragged into a storm that had been brewing long before this flight, long before he'd ever boarded the plane. "Let's start with the basics," she said, breaking the silence. "Your real name isn't Nathaniel Blackwood." His head snapped up, his eyes wide with shock. His real name? How could she possibly know that? She smiled faintly, as though she knew exactly what he was thinking. "The name you've been using, the one everyone knows, is a lie. Your real name is Marcus Wills. You were born to a different family, a family that the world, your world, would rather forget." Marcus's mouth went dry. His tongue felt thick in his mouth. He couldn't speak. His breath was shallow as he tried to process what she was saying, but nothing made sense. His name, wasn't his name? The thought felt like a punch to his stomach. Evelyn continued, "You were adopted by the Blackwood family when you were just a child. They gave you a new identity. They gave you a new life. And they erased all traces of your past. Of who you really are." It felt like the ground was shifting beneath him. He couldn't believe what he was hearing. This was madness. His life, his success, everything he'd worked for, had it all been built on lies? "You're lying," he said, more forcefully this time. "My parents are the Blackwoods. I don't know what kind of game you're playing, but I won't stand for it." Evelyn sighed, clearly unbothered by his outburst. "Your adoptive parents gave you everything you could ever want. Power, wealth, respect. But they never told you the truth, did they? They never told you where you really came from." He was starting to feel dizzy, his mind spinning with the weight of her words. Could it be true? Could everything he'd known about his life, about his family, be nothing more than an elaborate lie? "Why didn't they tell me?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. "Why keep something like this from me?" "Because they were protecting you," Evelyn answered softly. "They didn't want you to know about the past. About the secrets they were hiding. Secrets about your biological family. About me." His mind was racing now, but it was all a blur. The pieces weren't fitting together. I don't remember anything. Why can't I remember anything?" Evelyn's face softened. "It wasn't your fault. Your memories were erased, carefully hidden. Your adoptive parents wanted to keep you safe from the truth. But the truth has a way of coming out, no matter how hard we try to bury it." He leaned back in his seat, trying to steady himself. His heart was pounding in his chest, his hands clammy. His whole life was falling apart. What was he supposed to believe now? Who was he really? What was real? "Why now?" he asked, still reeling from the shock. "Why come to me now, after all these years?" Evelyn's expression hardened, her eyes darkening. "Because it's time. The truth can no longer be hidden. The past is catching up with all of us, Marcus. And now, you're part of it." A cold shiver ran down his spine as her words sank in. Whatever was coming, he wasn't prepared for it. This wasn't just a family secret. This was something much bigger. Something that would change his life forever. And it had all started with a single photograph. Marcus couldn't breathe. Evelyn's words were still echoing in his mind, playing over and over like a broken record. She was his sister. He was Marcus Wills, not Nathaniel Blackwood. His entire life, the name, the identity, everything he had believed, was built on a lie. And the truth, whatever that truth was now surfacing, threatening to drown him. He leaned back in his seat, clutching the armrest so tightly that his knuckles turned white. His pulse was hammering in his ears, and his vision swam in and out of focus. He tried to speak, to say something, but the words were trapped in his throat, refusing to come out. He had never felt so lost, so powerless in his entire life. For a moment, there was only the low hum of the airplane's engines and the distant murmur of other passengers. It seemed like the whole world had disappeared, leaving him alone with Evelyn and the shocking revelations she had just dropped on him. His life was being dismantled piece by piece, and all he could do was sit there, stunned and numb. Evelyn, on the other hand, remained calm. She sat there, her expression unreadable, as if she had been preparing for this moment for years. As if she knew exactly how he would react. Finally, Marcus found his voice, though it sounded small and far away. "You can't expect me to just accept this. I don't even know who you are. How do I know you're telling the truth?" Evelyn didn't flinch. She didn't even blink. "I'm not asking you to accept anything, Marcus. But you need to understand that this is bigger than both of us. You've been living in the dark for far too long. You deserve to know what really happened. Who are you? Where have you been all this time?" Marcus asked, his voice rising, filled with a mix of frustration and fear. Evelyn leaned forward slightly, her eyes locking with his. "I've been where you can't reach me. Where no one could. I've been watching from the shadows, waiting for the right moment to tell you the truth. And now that the moment has arrived, you have to be ready for what comes next." Marcus's mind was racing. He felt as though the floor beneath him was giving way, the entire foundation of his life crumbling. "What comes next? What are you talking about?" Evelyn's gaze softened just slightly. "The truth. Your truth. And the danger that's been lurking in your life without you even knowing." He leaned forward, feeling a surge of desperation. "Danger? What are you talking about? What kind of danger?" She took a deep breath, almost as if she were preparing herself to tell him something even more unimaginable than what she had already revealed. "Your real family, the Wills family, they weren't just regular people. They were involved in things that they kept hidden from the world. And when your adoptive parents took you in, they made sure you didn't know anything about it." Marcus stared at her, trying to make sense of the words coming out of her mouth. "Involved in what? What kind of things?" Evelyn's eyes flickered, her expression growing more serious. "It's a long story. A dangerous one. But to put it simply, the Wills family was part of something bigger, something that could have brought down powerful people. They made enemies. Dangerous enemies. And when they adopted you, they thought they were protecting you from everything. From the secrets, from the danger. But they didn't protect you from the truth." Marcus's mind was reeling. He had heard stories, whispers of things his parents had done, things he hadn't fully understood. But this was beyond anything he had imagined. He had no idea what to believe anymore. "Wait," he said, his voice cracking slightly. "You're telling me that my parents, my adoptive parents, were part of something criminal?" Evelyn nodded slowly, her face grim. "It's not just about crime. It's about power. They had ties to people who controlled more than just the law. They had ties to a network, a shadow organization that operated in the dark, pulling strings behind the scenes. Your adoptive parents weren't just wealthy, they were connected to forces that most people would never even dream of." Marcus shook his head, disbelief written all over his face. "And you're telling me this now? Why didn't you come to me sooner?" "I couldn't," Evelyn replied softly. The Wills family, your real family, made sure of that. For years, I had to stay hidden. I couldn't come forward without risking everything. But things are changing now. The past is catching up with us, and you need to be prepared. Prepared for what? He demanded. What do you mean by that? Evelyn's eyes flickered toward the window, her gaze distant for a moment. The people your family pissed off all those years ago are still out there. And they haven't forgotten about the Wills family, or you. Marcus's stomach dropped. You're telling me I'm in danger? She nodded again, more firmly this time. Yes. You've been a target for years, Marcus. You just didn't know it. His mind was spinning out of control. He had always thought that his life was perfect. He had everything anyone could want: money, power, status. But now, everything felt like a lie. A carefully constructed illusion. He wasn't who he thought he was, and his family's dark past was closing in on him. And if Evelyn was right, it was only a matter of time before those dangers caught up with him. So, what do I do? He asked, his voice hoarse. What can I do? Evelyn leaned back in her seat, her hands folding in her lap. We need to find out more about the people who are after you. We need to uncover everything. The truth behind your adoption, behind the Wills family, and behind the enemies they made. You can't fight what you don't understand, Marcus. The first step is learning the truth. And once you know it, you'll be able to protect yourself. The weight of her words sank in. Marcus could feel the weight of the situation pressing down on him, suffocating him. He was no longer in control of his life. The past was coming back with a vengeance, and he had no idea how to stop it. He sat in silence for a long time, the noise of the plane's engines the only sound filling the air. His thoughts were swirling, but he couldn't focus on any one thing. Everything felt too big, too overwhelming. And yet, beneath all the confusion and fear, one question kept gnawing at him. What do you want from me? He finally asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Evelyn met his gaze, her expression unreadable. I want you to know the truth. And I want you to survive. Marcus's eyes narrowed. Why me? Why not someone else? Because you're part of this, she said quietly. Whether you want to be or not. You can't escape your past, Marcus. It's already caught up with you. And if you want to survive, if you want to make sure this doesn't destroy you, you have to face it. You have to face who you really are. The silence between them deepened, thick with the weight of her words. Marcus couldn't escape. He couldn't run. His life, his true life, was pulling him back into a world he had no idea how to navigate. All he could do now was move forward, even though every step felt like stepping into the unknown. Marcus's mind raced as the plane continued its steady hum through the sky. He felt trapped in his own body, unable to process the magnitude of what Evelyn had revealed. His life, everything he had worked for, believed in, had suddenly turned into a tangled web of secrets, lies, and dangerous unknowns. He had thought he was on top of the world, yet he was standing at the edge of a cliff, ready to fall into a darkness he couldn't even begin to fathom. Evelyn had promised him answers, but she had given him only more questions. The truth about his real family, the Wills family, was something out of a spy thriller, the kind of thing you saw on screen but never thought could be real. He could barely comprehend it. But the reality was there, right in front of him, threatening to swallow him whole. We need to act fast, Evelyn said, breaking his spiraling thoughts. The people who are after you won't wait around. They know who you are. They've been watching you. Marcus looked at her, struggling to put his thoughts together. How do you know all of this? How are you so sure? Evelyn's expression softened, her eyes becoming distant for a moment as though she were reliving something painful. I've been on the run for years, Marcus. I know how they operate. They don't let anything slip. And they won't stop until they get what they want. His heart skipped a beat. What do they want from me? Her eyes met his, and for the first time, he saw a flicker of something other than cold determination. There was fear, real, raw fear. I don't know. But I do know they won't hesitate to hurt you if it means getting what they need. The plane suddenly dipped slightly, and Marcus's stomach lurched. But it wasn't the turbulence that made him uneasy, it was the thought of those mysterious enemies. The very people who had destroyed the life his adoptive parents had given him, and now, they were closing in. What do we do now? He asked, barely managing to keep his voice steady. We have to get to the bottom of this, Evelyn replied. We have to uncover what they want, why they want it, and how we can stop them. Marcus's mind raced. He had no idea how to do any of that. He had spent his entire life in the lap of luxury, never having to fight for anything, never having to face real danger. But now, everything was different. And he had no choice but to face it. For the first time, he realized how deeply he had been living in the dark. He had never questioned the life he'd been given, the wealth, the status, the power. But none of that mattered now. His past had come rushing back, and with it, a world of people and organizations he didn't understand. How are we going to find out what they want? Marcus asked, his voice thick with anxiety. Evelyn's lips tightened into a thin line. I've been tracking some of their movements for a while. I know a few people who can help. But it's dangerous. Very dangerous. Marcus's breath hitched. What kind of danger are we talking about? The kind where you can't trust anyone. The kind where your every move is being watched, and the people who come after you aren't afraid to kill if it means protecting their secrets. Marcus shuddered at the thought. He had no idea what he was getting into. He had lived a life of privilege, surrounded by luxury and comfort. But now, that life felt like a distant memory. The world had changed overnight, and he was no longer in control. Who are these people, Evelyn? Who's after me? He demanded, his voice growing more desperate. Evelyn hesitated, her eyes flicking to the window, her fingers absently tapping the armrest. They're part of something much bigger than just a crime syndicate. They operate in the shadows, controlling everything from politics to business to media. And they don't just work within one country, they have their hands in everything, everywhere. They're untouchable. Marcus couldn't believe what he was hearing. This sounded like a conspiracy theory straight out of a movie. But Evelyn wasn't the type to make wild claims. She was calm, measured, as though she had seen and experienced this world firsthand. Are we talking about a global organization? He asked, his voice faltering. Evelyn nodded slowly. Yes. A network of people who pull the strings from behind the scenes. Their power reaches into every corner of society. They control governments, corporations, everything. And your real family, your adoptive parents, they were tied to them. They were part of it. And now, you're caught in the middle. Marcus's head spun. This was more than just a criminal organization. It was a shadow government, a hidden world where the elite controlled everything. It was like something out of a thriller novel, but it was his reality now. But why me? He asked, his voice quiet. Why did they even adopt me if they knew this was coming? Evelyn's expression darkened. Your adoptive parents didn't know everything. But they knew enough to make sure you were hidden. The people after you, they didn't know you existed until recently. You were a name on a file, a child they had no reason to care about. But when they found out about you, things changed. Marcus clenched his fists. So what now? What do we do? Evelyn's eyes narrowed with resolve. We find the truth. We track down every lead we can, piece together the mystery of your real family, and figure out why they want you. Then, we use that information to take them down before they take us down. He swallowed hard. And if we can't? If we can't, then we prepare for the worst, Evelyn said, her voice cold and steely. "But we don't give up." The finality of her words sent a chill down his spine. He didn't know how much of this he could handle. But the more he thought about it, the more he realized that running wasn't an option. He had no choice but to dive into this dangerous world, to uncover the truth, even if it meant risking everything. As the plane began its descent, Marcus felt a knot form in his stomach. They were heading toward the unknown. Everything he had ever known was about to change, and there was no going back. They landed at an airport Marcus had never seen before. The moment they stepped off the plane, he could feel the weight of the situation pressing down on him. The air felt heavier, charged with an electricity he couldn't quite explain. It was as if the entire world were watching them, waiting for them to make their next move. Evelyn led him through the terminal, her pace quick and purposeful. Marcus followed, his mind still spinning. He couldn't shake the feeling that something was closing in on them, something dangerous, something they couldn't outrun. As they stepped outside, Evelyn turned to him. "We need to be careful. I've arranged a meeting with someone who might have answers. But we can't trust anyone." Marcus nodded, though he felt a surge of panic rising in his chest. "How do we know we can trust this person?" Evelyn looked at him, her expression hard. "Because they have no reason to lie to us. But I'll be watching every move they make. One wrong step, and we're out of here." Marcus didn't have time to ask any more questions. They had already crossed the line, and there was no turning back. They were in deep now. The only way out was through. As they made their way to the car, Marcus couldn't help but wonder how much further this would go. What kind of world had he been thrust into? And, more importantly, how much of the truth would he be able to handle once it all came to light? The evening air was cool, and Marcus felt a shiver creep up his spine as they stepped into the unmarked black SUV waiting for them. The car's tinted windows obscured the view of the outside world, trapping them in a cocoon of shadows. Evelyn slid into the passenger seat without a word, and Marcus followed, taking a seat beside her. His heart was pounding in his chest, his mind a storm of questions, doubts, and fears. Every moment felt like a step deeper into a nightmare he wasn't sure he could escape. As the car sped through the dark streets, Evelyn's sharp, unblinking eyes scanned every corner, every movement outside the window. She was on high alert, her body language tense, as though she were expecting danger to appear at any moment. "We're not safe here," she muttered, her voice low and urgent. "Not until we meet him." "Who is he?" Marcus asked, his voice betraying the unease that had settled in his stomach. He was used to being in control, used to making decisions that shaped his life. But now, he was being swept along in a storm, a passenger in a world he didn't understand. Evelyn's eyes flicked to him briefly, then back to the window. "His name is Alex Carter. He's complicated. But he knows things. Things that can help us. And right now, that's what we need. Why don't I feel reassured by that?" Marcus muttered under his breath. The name Alex Carter meant nothing to him, but the way Evelyn spoke of him, there was something about it that felt off. A flicker of distrust passed through him. Evelyn ignored his comment, her gaze narrowing as they turned onto a quieter street. "Stay sharp, Marcus. We don't know who's watching." Marcus nodded, but his mind was racing. The world had shifted beneath his feet in a matter of days. First, there was the plane incident with the woman he thought was just an ordinary passenger, who turned out to be tangled in a web of conspiracies. Then, the revelation about his real family, the powerful, dangerous Will's family. The people after him weren't just criminals. They were part of something much bigger, something that could destroy him if they wanted to. His thoughts were interrupted as the car slowed and pulled into an alley, its headlights dimming as they came to a stop. Marcus felt his breath catch in his throat. The place they were at now didn't look like somewhere anyone should be. It was quiet, dark, the only sound the hum of the SUV's engine and the distant echo of footsteps. Evelyn was already out of the car before he could even think to speak. She moved with the fluidity of someone who had done this countless times, calm, collected, with a sense of purpose that both unnerved and impressed him. Marcus hesitated for only a second before following her. "Stay close," she warned as she led him through the dark alleyway. The cold pavement beneath his feet felt as if it were pulling him further into a shadowed world he didn't belong in. Every instinct screamed at him to turn back, but Evelyn had already begun to walk faster, and there was no choice now but to follow. They reached a heavy steel door at the end of the alley. Evelyn didn't knock. She didn't need to. She simply pulled out a small, unmarked keycard, slid it into a hidden slot beside the door, and the heavy metal door creaked open. Inside was a dimly lit corridor. The walls were lined with faded gray paint, the air thick with the smell of dust and something else, something metallic, almost like blood. It wasn't a welcoming place. In fact, it was one of those places where you instinctively knew that bad things happened, where secrets were kept hidden behind layers of fear and lies. As they walked further into the building, Marcus couldn't help but notice how quiet it was. Too quiet. He had no idea where they were or what kind of people they were about to meet, but the uncertainty gnawed at him. Finally, they came to a steel door that looked like it could withstand an entire army. Evelyn knocked twice, a series of sharp, deliberate raps that echoed down the empty hallway. There was a long pause before a voice from inside responded. "Password?" the voice asked, muffled by the thick door. "Trust," Evelyn replied without hesitation. A moment later, the door swung open and a man stepped into view. He was tall and broad-shouldered, wearing a plain black t-shirt and jeans that looked a size too small. His face was hard, his jawline sharp, and his eyes seemed to assess everything in one swift glance. He didn't smile. He didn't frown. He just looked. "Evelyn," the man said simply, his voice low but commanding. Marcus couldn't help but notice how calm he was, how he seemed so in control. It was unnerving. The man didn't look like someone who was used to taking orders. He looked like someone who gave them. "This is Marcus," Evelyn said, nodding in his direction. The man's gaze shifted to Marcus, then back to Evelyn. "The one in the news?" "Yes," Evelyn confirmed. "The one they've been after." The man's eyes didn't soften. Instead, they hardened. "I thought you said he was just a pawn." "He is," Evelyn said. "But he's also more than that. He's the key." "The key to what?" Marcus asked, his voice edged with frustration. He was so tired of being in the dark, of being pulled along by people who seemed to know everything but refused to share anything. Alex didn't answer right away. Instead, he turned on his heel and motioned for them to follow him inside. Marcus had no choice but to comply. The room was small and filled with technology that looked far more advanced than anything Marcus had ever seen. Screens, wires, flashing lights, and blinking buttons filled the walls. In the center of the room was a large table, covered with papers, files, and documents that looked like they belonged to some kind of high-level intelligence agency. And in the middle of it all was a map of the world. Dots were scattered across it, marking locations, coordinates, and some things that Marcus didn't even understand. "Take a seat," Alex said, gesturing to the chair at the table. "We've got a lot to go over." Marcus sat down cautiously, still unsure of what he had gotten himself into. He had thought he was just a bystander in all of this, someone caught in a web of circumstance. But the more he learned, the more he realized how wrong he had been. This wasn't just a random conspiracy. This was something bigger, something far-reaching. And his role in it was becoming clearer, and more terrifying, by the minute. Alex began pacing the room, his eyes never leaving the map. "The people after you aren't just after your family. They're after something far more important. They want control. And you, he paused, his eyes locking with Marcus's, are the key to that control. Marcus's heart skipped a beat. What do you mean? What do they want from me? The Wills family isn't just a powerful family, Alex said, his voice grim. They're part of a much larger network. And that network, it controls everything. Marcus leaned forward, his mind racing. What kind of network? The kind that runs governments. The kind that controls markets. The kind that decides who lives and who dies. Marcus felt a chill run through him. He had been living in a bubble, unaware of the forces at play behind the scenes. But now, everything he thought he knew about his life was beginning to crumble. What does all of this have to do with me? Marcus asked, his voice tight with urgency. Alex looked at him, his expression darkening. It's time you learned the truth about your real family, Marcus. And the power they had. It's time you understood why they disappeared. Because someone didn't want them to succeed. Marcus's world seemed to spin as Alex's words sank in. The truth was slipping through his fingers, and he could feel the weight of it pressing down on him, threatening to crush him under its enormity. But there was no going back now. Whatever this was, whatever had been set into motion, it was too late to stop. And Marcus had no choice but to play along, to uncover the secrets of his past before they were lost forever. The air inside the dimly lit room grew heavier with each passing second. Marcus could feel the weight of the truth pressing down on him. His mind was racing, thoughts swirling, trying to make sense of everything that had been thrown at him in the past few days. Every detail, every word, seemed to unlock a new door, only to reveal another more terrifying reality behind it. He had thought he was just an ordinary man, caught in the crossfire of a chaotic world. But now? Now, he was part of something much bigger than himself, a part of a game where the stakes were life and death. Alex Carter paced slowly, his eyes locked on the map, tracing the various dots and coordinates that were scattered across it. His fingers hovered over one in particular, a red dot marking a location that seemed to pulse with an ominous energy. Do you know what this is? Alex asked, turning to Marcus. His voice was calm but filled with an underlying urgency, as if he was trying to prepare Marcus for something that was coming, something inevitable. Marcus didn't have to ask to know that whatever this was, it wasn't good. He shook his head. No. I have no idea. Alex's gaze hardened. This, Marcus, is the last known location of your family. Or at least, the last place they were before they vanished. Marcus's heart skipped a beat. The idea that his family had been involved in something so dark, so dangerous, was a bitter pill to swallow. But the more he learned, the more he realized that his family's disappearance wasn't a simple tragedy. It wasn't just a case of being in the wrong place at the wrong time. It was deliberate. They didn't just disappear, Alex continued, his voice steady. They were taken. And now, whoever did this is coming after you. The words hit Marcus like a physical blow. His thoughts reeled as his mind tried to piece together the fragments of his family's past. He had always known there was something unusual about his lineage, but he hadn't known just how deep the roots of his family's power and influence stretched. They wanted you, Alex said, walking closer to Marcus. Your family didn't disappear because they were weak. They disappeared because they were dangerous to the wrong people. Marcus felt a surge of anger, a mixture of frustration and disbelief. Dangerous to the wrong people, he repeated, his voice rising. What the hell does that mean? Alex's expression softened, a flicker of sympathy in his eyes. It means that your family was a threat to a very powerful group of people. People who control everything behind the scenes, governments, corporations, entire economies. And when they saw your family as a threat, they didn't just eliminate them, they erased every trace of them. The realization struck Marcus like a bolt of lightning. His family hadn't just been part of a legacy of wealth and influence, they had been part of a hidden power structure, a network so secretive that it could control the fate of nations. And now, Marcus was standing at the center of it all, a pawn in a game that he didn't even understand. But why me? Marcus asked, his voice shaky. Why am I the one they're after? Alex took a deep breath, his face hardening with resolve. Because you carry the bloodline. You are the last link to everything your family built. And they'll stop at nothing to make sure you don't unlock the secrets your family left behind. Secrets? Marcus asked, feeling the weight of the word settle on his chest like a heavy stone. What kind of secrets? The kind that could bring down the entire system, Alex said, his eyes locking with Marcus's. Your family knew too much. They were involved in things that could unravel the world as we know it. And that's why they were erased. Marcus's mind reeled as he tried to process what Alex was saying. This wasn't just about survival anymore. This wasn't just about him. This was about a global conspiracy, a hidden network of power and control that stretched across every corner of the world. And his family had been at the center of it all. What do we do now? Marcus asked, the desperation in his voice cutting through the tension in the room. Alex's eyes flashed with determination. We fight. We expose the truth. And we make sure they don't erase you, too. The words seemed impossible to believe. How could they possibly take on such an enormous force? What chance did they have against a network that had already taken everything from Marcus? But there was a fire burning inside him now, a sense of purpose he hadn't felt before. The truth was out there, and he wasn't going to let it slip through his fingers. He wasn't going to let them erase him too. Alex handed Marcus a small black device, no bigger than a smartphone. This is the key to everything, he said. It contains all the information your family left behind. All the files, the records, the evidence that could bring the whole system to its knees. But you need to be careful. There are people who will stop at nothing to get their hands on it. Marcus took the device, feeling the weight of it in his hand. It felt like the only thing connecting him to the world his family had been a part of, a world he barely understood but was now desperate to uncover. Where do we go from here? Marcus asked, looking to Alex for guidance. Alex's expression softened, and he gestured to the map on the wall. We go here. To this location. He pointed to a dark spot on the map, a place that seemed to have been marked with a deliberate sense of finality. Your family hid something there. And if we can find it, we'll have everything we need to expose them. Marcus nodded, his mind made up. There was no turning back now. His family's legacy, his own survival, it was all tied to this moment. The truth was within his grasp, and he wasn't about to let fear stop him from uncovering it. We leave now, Alex said, his tone brokering no argument. They moved quickly, exiting the building and stepping into the cold night air. The tension was palpable, as if the entire city held its breath in anticipation of what was to come. As they made their way to a nearby vehicle, Marcus couldn't help but feel the weight of the world bearing down on him. The stakes had never been higher, and the danger had never been more real. As the car sped through the streets, Marcus looked out the window, his mind a swirl of conflicting emotions. He was scared, of course. But there was also a part of him that was excited, a part of him that welcomed the challenge, the chance to finally uncover the truth. The world had tried to erase his family, to erase him. But Marcus wasn't going to let that happen. Not without a fight. As the miles passed and the car got closer to their destination, Marcus's thoughts turned to his family. What had they known? What had they uncovered before they were erased? He didn't have all the answers yet, but he knew one thing for sure, he was about to find them. The truth was waiting for him. And when he found it, the world would never be the same again. The car finally pulled up to a remote location, an abandoned building at the edge of the city. It was dark and desolate, the perfect hiding place for whatever secrets his family had left behind. This is it, Alex said, stepping out of the car. Get ready. Marcus stepped out behind him, his heart racing in his chest. They were about to uncover something that could change everything. But what would they find? And what would the consequences be? There was no turning back now. As they entered the building, the echoes of their footsteps reverberated through the empty halls. Marcus felt the weight of the past settling on him, and with each step, he knew they were getting closer to the truth. The answers were out there. And Marcus was ready to find them. The final part of the story delves deeper into Marcus's journey as he learns more about his family's hidden legacy and the powerful forces that are after him. The tension heightens as he and Alex head toward the ultimate confrontation with the truth. With every step, the stakes become higher, and the suspense builds toward a dramatic climax that promises to uncover life-changing revelations. The story ends on a cliffhanger, leaving readers eager for more. Subscribe my channel, press bell icon for more interesting stories. Do not forget to like, share and comments. Thank you.